incident where this man was died while being held down by a police officer in Minneapolis. And of course, the Minneapolis is a very liberal city. The mayor there, Jacob Fry, is a community organizer, a Jewish community organizer,
Yes.
who on March 10th, I think made March 10th, that was Abortion Provider Appreciation Day in Minneapolis.
Ha!
But he was out there when this occurred. He's out there stoking the fire because he was the one that said, immediately made a racial incident out of it, but also talked about 400 years of slavery and oppression. So he's stirring up. So then once again you have the Black Jewish Alliance reemerging here, right, to stir trouble up, kind of to
That's
stir the
right.
riot up here.
That's right. That's right. After it fell on hard times. Remember in New Jersey, because all that so-called white black conflict turned out to be Jewish black conflict, and we don't
Mm-hmm.
like to talk about that. That's not really something that's a productive way of looking at this issue. But there's a bigger issue that's now starting to emerge in Minneapolis, and that is where did that cop learn that knee hold? Where did he learn that?
I heard talk about this. That technique
Well,
is.
this is really unfortunate, but it looks as if there may be a link between the Jewish mayor and the cop kneeling on the guy's throat, because what we're talking about here is the Israelization of police training that's going on throughout the United States. This is something we talked about in South Bend. We probably talked about it on your show years must be years ago, because our illustrious gay mayor Pete brought in a mercenary from Tajikistan who worked for this Jewish operation that was involved in Israelization of police forces. So we're talking about police forces either being sent to Israel, where they learn these chokeholds because they've tried them out on Palestinians over there, and then they bring them back. They don't so much bring the chokehold back. They bring the attitude that goes with the chokehold back, and that's basically that we, the cops, are the Israelis, and you, the people, are Palestinians, and we're going to treat you like Palestinians. And so that's the story that's now starting to emerge here.
Mm-hmm.
So did these cops did they go to Israel to learn this? Plenty of cops have. The stories are all starting to emerge. If you type in Minneapolis police in Israel, you'll find all kinds of stories now about the police being trained to treat blacks this way.
Well, I was instructed by the Jewish mayor of Minneapolis, that it's about 400 years of oppression by white people. So.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, you have this militarization of the police force, which is, you said, is sort of an Israelization of the police force. This training programs, which I have read a lot about in the past 5-7 years, affecting the demeanor and the way that police these areas. But another factor, an element here is also, which you've written about in the past, is of course the problem of black criminality and how. I think a while back you wrote an article about the Moynihan report, and how the Moynihan report was sort of trying to take a moral, almost like a traditional Catholic approach to this, Catholic social teaching approach to the problems then existing in the black community, which was then a stunning 25% illegitimacy rate. Now it's close to 80%. But it was rejected because in order to embrace what Moynihan suggested, they would have had to reverse the sexual revolution. And what we're seeing now in these communities is a consequence of decades and decades of sexual revolution and all the evils that come from that. Illegitimacy, family breakup, or families not even forming at all. And you also gave a talk one time. It was titled "How Drive-By Shootings." How contraception leads to drive-by shootings. So, can you provide some insight in this?
Yeah, that talk was based on the Moynihan report.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, we reached a kind of crossroads in America at around 1963, when Moynihan traced the problem of poverty. Black poverty is what we're talking about, to illegitimacy. And at that time, it was 21% illegitimacy rate among, and so he decided that the cure to poverty was strengthening the black family, which is all classic Catholic social teaching. He was aware of that. He was a Catholic and so on and so forth. but he hit a brick wall when he got to Washington because the fix was already in. Okay, the oligarchs at that time, the elites, they knew how they were going to fix the problem of black poverty, and it was by eliminating black people. And the way they're going to do that is birth control. And this was the moment. At this point, birth control was still illegal, certainly in the state of Connecticut and probably across the country. So the government had to get involved in birth control in order to do this effectively. And eventually, 65, Griswold versus Connecticut got passed by the Supreme Court, struck down all of the birth control laws, and now the government could get involved, and that's precisely what they did. So instead of doing what Moynihan said and providing, let's say, twice a day mail delivery, and to do that, we're going to hire black men who are heads of families so they can provide for their families. Instead of going in that direction, they put birth control clinics into black churches. I talk about this in two books. In John Cardinal Crowell and the Cultural Revolution, I name the churches in Philadelphia where that happened, and also I believe the other side of it would have been Slaughter of Cities, Urban Renewal, and Ethnic Cleansing, which is a continuation of that story, and also in Libido Dominandi. So I mentioned it a number of different times. But so the net result was that it was throwing gasoline on the fire. The irresponsibility in the black community that was largely the result of disruption, internal migration, always leads to moral decline, increased enormously. So from 21% to close, as you mentioned, close to 80% now illegitimacy among blacks. It was like throwing gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, when those riots were occurring, I thought of that article. Now, you wrote that article in Culture Wars. It was in 1995, I think.
Yeah, it was early. I actually, one of my fondest memories was giving that speech at Harvard University, of all places, where this was the year my son graduated from Harvard. So it was 1992. And I gave, the talk was, I think it was called Spade Kicks, which is the quote I got from On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And how the Negro became a paradigm of sexual liberation. And then I did the poster myself, and I had a picture of all these white guys at Small's Paradise ogling some high yaller dancing there with the dance of the seven veils or something like that. Well, it was like setting off an atomic bomb at Harvard. They were furious. And this was probably the last time you could ever say something like that at Harvard. When I was there, I heard a phrase called political correctness. I'd never heard it before, but it was apparently the mantra at Harvard at that time. So I got everybody was outraged. So I got to give my talk, and one of I needed a bigger room. And they had scheduled Norman Mailer to give a talk. And I got Norman Mailer's room, which was a big auditorium, and he got my broom closet where he talked about something or other. I don't know, whatever he talked about. But I always felt a kind of satisfaction that I took Norman Mailer's room away from him.
That's kind of funny because Norman Mailer, he was the one that came up with the concept of the white Negro, right?
Yeah, I quoted him in that. That was a seminal idea. It was called it should have been called the Jewish Negro, but it was called the white Negro. It had a lot of effect at that time. So we got about 400 angry Harvard professors and students showed up, and 200 of them marched out in the middle of my talk. But it was all based on the Moynihan report. And one guy said at some point, he says, "Well, I've heard all these quotes before, but that's not what they mean." And I said, "Well, don't tell me what they mean. I'm here to tell you what they mean." But anyway, so I was he graduated. My son graduated at the end of the year, and we're pick up the copy of the Harvard Crimson, the year in review, and it turns out of the 50 most significant events of that year, my talk was 3 of them.
Well, that's good.
So then So then they don't hand out the degree in Harvard Yard. So Adam had to go back to the dorm, and when they called out his name, everybody booed as he went up to get his degree. So then he kind of looked kind of sheepish after that. And I said, Adam, don't worry. If they had cheered, I'd be upset.
Yes.
This place.
Now,
and so then just to finish this, yeah. There's this black woman. She's looking at me and I'm looking at her. And then she says to me, "You're Mike Jones, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Yeah, we went to Temple together." And then he said, "Yeah, you went to Sweden, didn't you?" I said, "No, I went to Germany, but yeah, you got the idea. I did leave." And so then her daughter shows up. This is funny. Her daughter is the head of the Black Students Association. So it turns out I know your mama. And the mother says to her, this is Dr. Jones. I went to Temple. We were at Temple graduate school together. Do you know him? And the daughter says, "I know of him." And she walks away. So she was like the classic uppity Harvard student. And it wasn't good enough that I knew her mother. It just wasn't going to, there was nothing I could do to redeem myself in her eyes.
Well,
but that was then.
Yeah.
That was way back then.
Well, you laid it out what the problem was in that article you write at the end. I don't have the article before me. A while back I did a show based on that article, talking. It was a big part of our conversation, talking what was going on, with the topic of that time. But yeah, actually, the topic was the Moynihan report. Actually, of that show. That's why. And I remember reading that article years ago, and I reordered a PDF copy of it. I no longer had the physical copy of it. I knew there was some article that I read 20 or so years ago that covered this. But it basically it says whatever reforms you propose, whatever problems you address, if you don't address the moral problems of the individuals and how they're behaving, they're pointless anyway. Because if you're misbehaving sexually, you're causing all this disruption, all this disorder in the society at the most basic level. You're not going to have a broader social order because you have so much, you're introducing so much disorder in your own own life.
Right.
That society itself, which is an extension of us individuals, isn't going to have any order, and that's where the Great Society failed to address that. In fact, in your article, they were actually against it because they didn't want to give up what they saw as the gains of the sexual revolution. This also suggested in that program is a very it's a paternalistic, it's a patriarchal view in the best sense, meaning that you need fathers providing income, taking care of the family so the mother can raise the kids and you have a family. And this went against the zeitgeist of the age, which is sexual liberation, feminism, these things, where these institutions could be dissolved and weakened and you could still have a functional society. And we're learning well today you can't, and we see that in the riots today, because I suggest if you were able to canvass all the participants who are looting and burning up their neighborhoods, very few of them live in intact families, I would say. And
Yeah, well, it also goes back to the founding of America and this experiment in ordered liberty, because John Adams said we have no constitution that functions in the absence of a moral people.
Mm-hmm.
And Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno said there is no social progress outside the moral order. So this is like the central tradition of the West, if you want to talk about it that way. And if you don't have self-control, then you have to have external control. Well, guess what we're watching now? We're watching one strategy after another of external control that's being imposed on people who are becoming more and more unruly. And so the COVID lockdown is now followed by martial law.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in Minneapolis. I don't know where else they have martial law, but they certainly have it there.
Well, I mean, it's hard. I mean, I don't know if you're looking at what's going on in several cities. I suggest a lot of this is probably being fomented or created by the usual suspects, whether it's Black Lives Matter and Soros-funded organizations. And we've had recently, George Soros has been very involved in funding local, elections for district attorneys.
Right.
In these
district attorney in Philadelphia is a Soros puppet.
Yes.
Is the Jewish mayor of Minneapolis a Soros puppet? Did he get Soros money? Is that why he's in charge there? Did that lead to the Israelization of the Minneapolis Police Department? These are all questions that need to be answered.
Yeah, and apparently there are protests in Hawaii, in Europe and in Ireland over a case in Minneapolis. That's a little suspect to me. And then, of course, the media is there to stoke the flames, and I find it funny that the rioters are getting better press than a lot of the protesters were getting, who were protesting. The largely white protesters who were protesting peacefully the lockdowns. We're asked to understand their motivations, whereas the worst motivations were imparted to the people who were protesting the lockdowns in Michigan and in other states.
Yeah, that's right. So Antifa has been named, Trump named Antifa as the outside agitators working in Minneapolis. And Attorney General Barr is now reminding him that it's against the law to cross state lines to engage in violent demonstrations. Mm-hmm. So maybe some good will come out of that. I think Trump has designated Antifa a terrorist organization. That was sort of waiting in the wings. But what happens to law enforcement? Why hasn't law enforcement been looking into Antifa? Why haven't they done anything? Where's the FBI these days? Mm-hmm. Well, the answer is the ADL and the SPLC got in bed with the FBI and started pointing out the people that they wanted them to investigate, and they weren't criminals. And so as a result of wasting their time with the SPLC, they finally broke their relationship with the SPLC. I mean, why they ever got involved in the first place is mysterious. For an intelligence organization and you didn't know about the SPLC, this is ridiculous. Same thing with the ADL. Okay, so you listen to those people and then they tell you who the criminals are. And it turns out that the criminals turn out to be the people they don't like. They're not criminals. It's just that the ADL doesn't like them. The SPLC doesn't like them. And so that, again, lends this credence to this Israelization narrative. So you wasted all your time with people who were not criminals, and now you let this criminal organization just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's calling the shots in places like Minneapolis, and finally the Justice Department awakes to this fact, and now they got to do something.
Yeah, and I suspect if you had a thorough investigation of Antifa and even Black Lives Matter, and you started doing a forensic analysis of the funding, you might run into funding from Open Society or even the SPLC, and that would be a criminal network, and you can use RICO against them and shut them down. But if SPLC is consulting with the FBI, that's a conflict of interest, but they've been doing it until fairly recently.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of agitation, and once you don't need, you can have a few people stirring things up, but once law enforcement recedes and the force of disorder are released, a lot of these people, all you need to do is just show that you can get away with a lot of mayhem and looting. They'll do their part. They're like, as the lumpen proletariat, like these black gangs in Minneapolis or Philadelphia. If you just give them the green light to wreak havoc and steal and hurt people, they're going to do it for a couple days.
Yeah. Well, that was the war on poverty did that in Chicago. They gave Sergeant Shriver gave almost $1 million to the Blackstone Rangers, which was a gang. And in the church committee hearings in the 70s, it turns out that they knew they were engaged in criminal activity and gave them the money anyway. Well, that means you're subsidizing criminal activity, aren't you? Mm-hmm. So once again, we got these proxy warriors,
So it's it's a colored revolution type thing where you have proxy warriors. This is like Gene Sharp and this model that we see play out like in Libya or in Syria or in the Middle East, where it looks like it's spontaneous. They have some pretext or they have some incident, like a George Floyd incident where he dies at the hands of a cop, or you have an incident like in Tunisia where someone lights himself on fire, and this sparks the revolution. Then you have this colored revolution thing where you have social media being used, and this is all an intelligence operation to undermine the government. And you could make the case that what we're seeing here is something going on here in the United States where you have the deep state trying to create mayhem throughout the summer for whatever reason. This is just after the whole COVID-19 hoax or operation.
Right.
Now all of a sudden you have all these protests, all these riots to distract attention away from what they're still doing to the economy with the lockdown.
Right. Never let a crisis go to waste. Mm-hmm. So like with the COVID, I had an interesting conversation with a lady here who's a nurse. at a school here, and she said she thinks the coronavirus swept through that school in October.
Mm-hmm.
She got really sick, and she described her symptoms. It sounded like COVID virus to me. Well, that was October. Well, nobody was talking about it then. So when did it become news? Well, it became news when the stock market crashed.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you don't have to be a conspiracy nut to see that there's some type of that would make sense, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? It doesn't have to be pure coincidence. The issue is not when did it happen. The issue is when did it become news? When did it block out something else? And I think the same thing applies now with the eclipse of COVID in our minds. It's being that news cycle went way too long. People were getting sick. Now we have a new news cycle. Now it's going to be back to Black Lives Matter, the old Ferguson thing resurrected again.
Yeah.
Because that's a tried and true way to get people scared or riled up, depending on who you're talking to.
This piece you wrote, Nazi Hunters and Their Catholic Proxy Warriors. You reviewed this HBO series, a series which I did not see, but I've seen clips, various clips on it. I've read a lot about it. This Nazi Hunters, where it's a story about, I guess, sort of like a Wiesenthal type group where they hunt Nazis down in America in the 1970s and I guess assassinate them because no one else is doing anything about it.
Yes. It's a pure Jewish paranoid fantasy that grew out of the great internet battle of 2019. Now, the COVID is the extension of the internet battle. It's obvious now. The two Harvard professors wrote an article in the Atlantic, said exactly that. Other people have said it. Basically, the Harvard professors said that the battle in 2019 was over unwanted content. The oligarchs were not happy. They didn't say unwanted by whom, but it's clear it's unwanted by them. So this grew up out of that paranoid atmosphere where last year where everybody was talking about hate crime.
Okay,
so there was a wave of paranoid Jewish fantasy that after last year, which basically was the year of the battle over the internet, hate speech, all that other type of stuff, when the ADL basically tried to shut down everyone and tried to become the commissar of who was allowed to speak and who was not allowed to speak. So in order to keep the money flowing into the ADL, they have to generate fear, and these programs are there to generate fear. It wasn't just it started off, I think, a year before, The Man from High Castle. Then it was Nazi Hunters, and then after that it was The Plot Against America, which is based on a Philip Roth novel. All of them have the premise is that basically the country that is the most philo-Semitic country in human history is just teeming with Nazis who are ready to take over and exterminate Jews. That's the premise of all of these fantasies.